She set the last glass on the tray and checked the clock. It was 1956, and in 11 minutes the doorbell would ring on the most important room in America. For one generation of American women, the living room was not where you collapsed at the end of the day. It was a stage. Between roughly 1948 and 1962, the cocktail hour ran the social life of the suburbs, and it ran on rules. Not laws written in any book, but a quiet choreography every good hostess knew. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. Tonight we are walking back into that room. The numbers tell you how seriously they took it. By 1957, American families were spending an estimated $41 billion a year on the home, and a healthy slice went to the rituals of hosting. A new house went up roughly every minute somewhere in the country. Each one came with a living room built for company, and a woman expected to fill it. She was not just decorating. She was keeping a social code alive, one Friday night at a time. He loosened his tie at the office, glanced at his watch, and felt it, that pull toward home that arrived at exactly 6 o'clock. In a 1950s household, the cocktail hour was not a vague evening blur. It opened at 6 and closed by 8, 2 hours bracketed tighter than a train schedule. Guests who drifted in at 5:30 caught the hostess mid-curl. Guests still talking at 9 had broken something invisible. The window was the first rule, and everything else hung on it. The reason the window mattered was dinner. The cocktail hour was an overture, never the whole opera. 2 drinks, a few clever crackers, conversation warmed to a glow, and then everyone moved to the table while they were still hungry and still charmed. A hostess who let the hour stretch to 3 watched her roast dry out and her guests turn dull. Timing was not stiffness. It was mercy. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. The doorbell rang, and she did not send a child. She did not call out, "Come in." She crossed the room herself, opened the door with both the porch light and her face turned on, and met the first guests on the threshold. In the 1950s, the greeting was the hostess's job and no one else's. Those first 8 seconds set the temperature of the whole night, and she knew it the way she knew her own kitchen. What made the door greeting an art was the handoff. She took the coats. She took the hostess gift with real delight, and she walked the new arrivals straight into the knot of people already talking, naming them as she went. No guest stood alone for even a minute. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and it started in the first 30 steps from the door to the drinks. A guest abandoned in a doorway was a hostess's quiet failure. Against the wall, on chrome wheels, sat the most quietly powerful object in the house. The bar cart rolled into American living rooms after the war and never really sat still. By the late 1950s, it was less a piece of furniture than a statement, polished, stocked, and positioned where the host could reach it without turning his back on the conversation. A bare cart said one thing about a household. A full one said another. The cart had an order to it that guests never saw being arranged but always felt. Spirits at the back, mixers in the middle, the tools and the ice in front where the host worked. A good cart held the essentials a hostess kept on hand, the bottles, the bitters, the little dishes of garnish, so that no one ever heard the dreaded sentence, "We seem to be out of that." Being out of something was not a small thing. It was a crack in the performance. She did not touch the shaker. In most 1950s homes, there was a clean division at the cocktail hour, and everyone understood it without a word. The man of the house mixed the drinks. The woman ran the room. He stood at the cart playing bartender. She moved through the guests like a current, and between them they covered every corner. The split looks old-fashioned now, but it meant nobody was ever both trapped at the bar and missing from the conversation. There was strategy hidden in the split. The host at the cart became a fixed point, a place guests could drift toward for a refill and a few private words. The hostess stayed free to rescue a wallflower, refill a snack bowl, or steer a conversation away from trouble. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart, and she knew her real job was not the drinks at all. It was making sure every single person felt seen. There was an arithmetic to the evening that nobody printed, but everybody followed. Roughly 2 drinks across the cocktail hour, paced slow, and then dinner arrived to catch everyone at exactly the right altitude. The point was never to get a room drunk. The point was to loosen it, to turn polite strangers into people laughing at the same joke, and then to feed them before the glow tipped into something messier. The smart hostess managed that altitude on purpose. She watched the snack tray as carefully as the glasses, because crackers and cheese were not decoration, they were ballast. A guest with something in his stomach stayed charming. The whole rhythm of the night was built to deliver people to the dinner table happy, talkative, and steady on their feet. It vanished when the dinner party did, but the logic behind it was simply good hosting. Every house had one. A drink the host made better than anyone, poured a little more proudly, and offered before a guest could even ask what there was. In the 1950s, the signature drink was a kind of household signature, an old-fashioned in this home. A martini in that one, something with a maraschino cherry in the one down the block. It told you who lived there before they said a word. The signature drink solved a real problem with grace. It saved the host from taking 12 separate orders and saved the guest from the small panic of choosing. It also let a household build a tiny reputation. People remembered the home where the drinks were always just so, and an invitation there carried a little extra shine. A signature was confidence you could hand someone in a glass, and it asked nothing of the guest but to enjoy it. Before the first guest arrived, there was the matter of the ice. It sounds small until you remember there were no automatic ice makers in most homes, so the hostess filled trays the night before, cracked them by hand, and kept a packed silver bucket close to the cart. Warm drinks were a tell. They said the hostess had not planned, and planning was the whole game. Good ice was a quiet form of respect. It meant the host had thought ahead, that the bucket would not run dry at 7:15, that a guest's second drink would be as cold and clear as the first. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the simple discipline of always having enough ice is one of those small worlds. Nobody praised it. Everybody noticed the moment it was missing. She opened the cabinet, and there they were, in rows, each shape for a purpose. The 1950s hostess did not serve every drink in the same tumbler. A martini went into a stemmed glass, so a warm hand never touched the bowl. A highball went tall. Sherry went into something small and delicate. The right glass was not snobbery. It was the difference between a drink that stayed cold and one that quietly died. There was a logic baked into every shape. The stem kept body heat away from the chilled cocktail. The tall highball gave the bubbles room to rise. The wide coupe let the aroma open up. Women learned this from their mothers and from the homemaking magazines that ran whole pages on it, and they passed it down without ceremony. They never wrote it down for strangers, but in their own kitchens, every woman knew it cold. Tucked beside the glasses was a little stack of cloth, and it did more work than anyone gave it credit for. The cocktail napkin in a 1950s home was both manners and engineering. It caught the sweat of a cold glass before it reached a wood table. It gave a nervous guest something to do with one hand, and the prettier ones, embroidered or monogrammed, quietly showed the care the hostess had put in. Behind the napkin stood its serious cousin, the coaster, and behind both stood a real fear. A water ring on a polished walnut table was close to a small tragedy in a house where furniture was bought to last a lifetime. So the napkins came out, the coasters came out, and the hostess watched the tabletops with one eye all night. Protecting the room was simply part of loving the room. On the side table, arranged like a tiny city, sat the food that was never meant to be dinner. The 1950s cocktail hour ran on small bites, deviled eggs, cheese on toothpicks, little crackers crowned with something pink, and the famous canapes that took a hostess hours and vanished in 20 minutes. The rule was simple. Nothing that needed a fork, nothing that needed a plate, nothing that pulled a guest off their feet. The genius of the one-handed bite was that it kept the room moving. A guest balancing a fork and a plate is anchored to a chair. A guest with a cracker in one hand and a glass in the other is free to drift, to laugh, to cross the room to someone new. The food was engineered for circulation. The smartest hostesses made things that traveled, refilled the trays before they emptied, and never let a guest see a bare plate. In the middle of it all sat something with no purpose at all except beauty. A low arrangement of flowers, never tall enough to block a face across the table, cut that afternoon or bought from the florist on the corner. The centerpiece was the hostess saying, without a word, this evening was worth fresh flowers, and this room was worth dressing up. It cost a little. That was exactly the point. The low rule was about people, not flowers. A tall arrangement looked grand and ruined everything because it split the table and hid the very faces guests came to see. So the hostess kept it under the line of sight where the conversation could flow straight across. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and part of that was knowing that the most important thing on the table was never the thing on the table. It was the people around it. Before a single guest arrived, she dropped the needle. Something low and easy filled the room, just under the level of talk, the way a good fire crackles without demanding attention. The 1950s hostess understood that silence at a party was an enemy, and loud music was a worse one. The record on the console was set to a volume you could talk over without raising your voice, and it stayed there all night. The music did invisible work. It filled the gaps when conversation dipped, it gave shy guests a thing to comment on, and it kept the whole room at one gentle temperature. A hostess records the way she chose flowers, on purpose and in advance, and she never let the music get loud enough to make people shout. A room you have to shout over is a room nobody relaxes in. She knew that without ever being taught it in words. She walked the room before the guests came and turned off the overhead light. In its place, she lit the lamps, the table lamp, the floor lamp, the little one in the corner, until the room glowed instead of glared. The 1950s hostess knew a hard ceiling light flattened a room and aged every face in it. Lamplight did the opposite. It softened everything and made even an ordinary living room feel like an occasion. The trick was in the layers. Several small light sources scattered around a room create soft shadows and warmth, while one big light from above creates a flat, unforgiving glare. Hostesses learned to light corners, to keep the bulbs low, to let the room feel like dusk indoors. People look better in lamplight, and they feel better too, more relaxed, more willing to linger. It disappeared from most homes, but it still works in any room you care about. An hour before the doorbell, she was already dressed, already in heels, already wearing the lipstick she had chosen that morning. The 1950s hostess did not greet her guests in the apron she cooked in. She did the work early, then changed, because a hostess who looked harried made her guests feel like a burden. Looking ready was a gift she gave the room. The logic was generous, not vain. When the hostess looked calm and put together, guests relaxed because nothing makes a visitor anxious faster than a frazzled host. So she planned backward from the doorbell, finished the deviled eggs with time to spare, traded the apron for earrings, and met the night looking like she had been waiting all day to enjoy it. The effort was real. The whole art was in hiding it. She seemed to be just chatting, but she was working. A skilled 1950s hostess steered the conversation the way a good driver steers a car, gently and almost invisibly. She knew which guest had just returned from a trip and asked about it. She knew which two had a friend in common and introduced the thread. The talk that felt so effortless was, in truth, quietly conducted from the edge of the room. There were guardrails, too. The old wisdom warned against a few touchy topics at a mixed gathering, and most hostesses kept to it, because a room that drifts into a heated argument is a room that stops being fun. The job was not to silence anyone. It was to keep the evening warm, to pull a quiet guest into the circle and ease a loud one back, so that everyone left feeling they had been good company. That skill has nearly vanished, but the need for it never did. Watch her across an entire evening, and you would notice something strange. She almost never sat. The 1950s hostess stayed on her feet, drifting from group to group, topping up a glass here, refilling a tray there, catching the guest who had gone quiet in the corner. Sitting meant settling, and settling meant some corner of the room went unwatched. The job did not really stop until the last coat was handed back. It sounds exhausting because it was, and yet the women who did it well made it look like pleasure. The constant small motion was how a hostess kept the room alive, how she made sure no glass sat empty and no guest sat ignored. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart, and the heart of it was simple. The host rests after the guests are gone, never during. The evening belonged to the people in the room. On nearly every side table sat a small dish of glass or brass, and to understand the room you have to understand it. In the 1950s, smoking was woven into social life, and a hostess was simply expected to set out ashtrays the way she set out napkins. We know now what that habit cost, and no one today should take it up, but as a matter of history, the ashtray was as standard a fixture of that living room as the lamp beside it. The etiquette around it was elaborate and entirely of its era. Where the ashtrays went, how often they were quietly emptied, the little table lighters set out for guests, all of it was choreography a hostess managed without comment. Attitudes changed completely in the decades that followed, and what was once a mark of a well-run room became something we left behind for good reasons. It vanished, and unlike most of these rituals, we do not miss it. It belongs to the history of the room, not its revival. She reached to the high shelf for the things that only came down for company. The 1950s home kept two sets of nearly everything. The everyday and the good, and the cocktail hour called for the good. The crystal that was a wedding gift, the silver that got polished twice a year, the little dishes that lived in tissue paper most of the time. Using them was a way of telling guests, "You are worth the best we have." There was risk in it, and that was the meaning. The good crystal could chip. The silver had to be hand-washed and dried at midnight, and still she brought it out, because saving your best things for a someday that never comes was, to that generation, a small sadness. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the women who used their good china understood the opposite truth. The best things are for using, and the people in your living room are the reason to use them. In the kitchen, out of sight, a second clock was running. The hostess timed the warm bites to come out of the oven right as the conversation hit its stride, never before, never after. A tray of something hot arriving at the perfect moment relit a room that was starting to flag. It was theater, and the timing was everything, because food that came too early went cold, and food that came too late arrived to a room already thinking about going home. The best hostesses choreographed the whole sequence in advance. Cold things out first, the room settling, then the warm things at the midpoint as a little lift, all paced so the guests glided into dinner without ever feeling rushed. None of it was improvised. It was rehearsed in her head days before, the way a stage manager rehearses a show. They never wrote it down, but every woman who ran a good evening knew the order by heart. 2 days after the party, an envelope arrived in the hostess's mailbox in a familiar hand. The thank you note was not optional in the 1950s. A guest who had been fed and entertained sat down within a day or two and wrote, by hand, on real paper to say so. It closed the circle of the evening, and it kept the whole social web spinning, because manners then were a kind of currency everyone agreed to spend. Reciprocity ran underneath all of it. To be hosted was to owe an invitation in return, and the calendar of the suburbs turned on that quiet debt, this couple to dinner this month, that couple the next. It was not cold bookkeeping. It was how a neighborhood became a community, one returned invitation at a time. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and she also knew that the favor of an evening was always, gently, repaid. For the bigger nights, she brought out the great glass bowl. The punch bowl was the 1950s answer to a crowd, a way to serve 20 people without standing at the cart all evening mixing one drink at a time. It sat in the center of the table, ringed with its little matching cups, a centerpiece you could drink, and it let the host actually join his own party instead of pouring through it. The punch bowl carried its own little code. It was self-service, which freed the host, but the hostess kept an eye on the level and refreshed it before it ran low, and she made sure the ladle and the cups were always within easy reach. A bowl that sat empty was as bad as a dry bar cart. Done right, it turned a house full of people into one shared, easy table, and that was the whole point of the room. The guests had rules too, and they knew them before they rang the bell. You never arrived empty-handed. A small box of chocolates, a bunch of flowers, a bottle for the host, something to put in the hostess's hands the moment she opened the door. The hostess gift was a guest's half of the bargain, a way of saying thank you for the trouble before the evening had even begun. Good guests carried more than gifts. They arrived close to on time, neither early nor fashionably late. They made an effort to talk to people they did not know, and they left on the early side rather than wearing out their welcome. The whole evening worked because both sides knew their parts. A great hostess could only do so much with guests who would not play along, and the best nights happened when everyone, host and guest alike, knew the steps. She did not wait to be asked. The coats were barely off before the question came, gentle and certain.
"What can I get you to drink?"
In a 1950s home, the first drink was offered almost the instant a guest crossed the threshold. Because a guest with a glass in hand has a place to stand, a thing to hold, a way into the room. The empty-handed minute right after arrival was the most awkward minute of any party, and a good hostess erased it. That first glass did quiet psychological work. It gave the newcomer something to do with their hands, a reason to move toward the group, a small ritual that said the evening had officially begun for them. The hostess who handed it over fast was not pushing drinks. She was dissolving the awkwardness of a doorway. It disappeared along with the cocktail hour itself, but the instinct behind it, never let a guest feel stranded, is the oldest hosting wisdom there is. She had moved the chairs that afternoon, and no one would ever know she had. The 1950s hostess arranged her seating before anyone arrived, pulling chairs into a loose circle close enough that people could hear each other without leaning. A room full of furniture pushed flat against the walls makes guests shout across a void. A room arranged in a tight cluster makes a conversation happen almost by itself. The cluster was the secret to the easy talk those evenings were famous for. Close seating meant low voices, shared laughter, the sense of one conversation instead of several strangers stranded in corners. The hostess thought about who would sit near whom, separated the two who never got along, set the shy guest beside the warm one. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew that the room itself, arranged just so, did half the hostessing for her. Near the end of the evening, something shifted, so subtle most guests never caught it. The hostess gave the signal. Maybe she stopped refilling glasses. Maybe she brought out coffee, the gentle announcement that the cocktail portion was over. The 1950s hostess knew how to end a night as gracefully as she began it, because a party that does not know how to stop becomes a party nobody remembers fondly. The graceful close was its own small art. She never rushed anyone, but she let the energy wind down on purpose, so guests left while they were still glad they had come, carrying the night home like something to keep. The best evenings ended a little before anyone wanted them to, on a high note, with a warm goodbye at the door. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. Knowing when to stop is the rarest skill of all. There was a reason the cocktail hour landed in the living room and not the kitchen. In the post-war house, the kitchen was the woman's workshop, private and a little chaotic, and no guest was ever meant to see it mid-battle. The living room was the public face, the room you kept presentable at all times, the room a neighbor might glimpse through the picture window. Entertaining, there was a way of showing the household at its very best. The cocktail shaker itself had a small ceremony around it. The host did not stir quietly in a corner. He shook with a little flourish, the ice rattling like applause, the whole performance part of the entertainment. Guests watched, and that was intended. The making of the drink was a tiny piece of theater that pulled the room together and gave the host his moment at the center of the evening before he handed it all back to his wife. Children, when there were children, had their own quiet role in all of this. They were often fed early, kissed goodnight, and sent upstairs before the guests arrived, so the cocktail hour could be wholly the grown-ups' time. Some were allowed to pass a tray of nuts for a few minutes, a small apprenticeship in hosting, before vanishing up the stairs. They watched from the landing and learned the choreography years before they would ever run it themselves. The garnish was never an afterthought. A twist of lemon peel, a single olive, a maraschino cherry, a sprig of mint, each one chosen to match the drink and prepared in advance in its own little dish. It cost almost nothing, and it changed everything, turning a plain pour into something that looked considered. The hostess, who set out neat dishes of garnish, was telling her guests, before a word was spoken, that tonight the details had been thought through. The coffee that ended the night was a ritual all its own. Brought out in the good pot with the good cups, it did two jobs at once. It gently signaled that the drinking was done, and it sent guests home clear-headed rather than wobbly. A thoughtful hostess always had it ready, often with a small sweet to go beside it, so the evening landed softly instead of just stopping. The last cup of coffee was the period at the end of the sentence. Conversation had its own currency, and the best hostesses minted it in advance. She kept a few things in her back pocket, a piece of mild news, a question about someone's garden or grandchild, a story she knew would land. When a silence threatened, she spent one. It looked effortless, but a quiet evening was a hostess's nightmare, and the women who hosted well were never caught without something warm and easy to say. The invitation itself followed rules now almost entirely forgotten. For a planned evening, it came by telephone or even by a written card a week or more ahead, with a clear start time and an unspoken understanding of when things would end. A guest replied promptly, because leaving a hostess guessing at her numbers was a small rudeness. The whole evening began long before the doorbell, in the careful courtesy of how people asked and answered. Even the seasons shaped the room. In summer, the windows came open and the drinks turned long and cold and full of ice. In winter, the lamps burned a little earlier, the curtains were drawn against the dark, and the bites coming out of the kitchen turned warm and rich. A good hostess read the calendar like a script and dressed her evening to match it, so the cocktail hour in February never felt like the one in July. The neighborhood watched and kept a gentle score. Word traveled about whose evenings were the warmest, whose drinks were the best, who made a guest feel most at home. A reputation as a fine hostess was a real social asset in the suburbs of the 1950s, earned one Friday at a time and worth protecting. None of it was written down anywhere, but every woman on the block knew exactly where she stood in that quiet, unspoken ranking. The serving tray was a tool with its own etiquette. The hostess carried it low and steady, offered from the left, never reached across a guest, and never set it down and walked away. The tray was how the room got served without anyone having to get up, and a hostess who handled it gracefully kept the whole evening flowing. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew the small, precise dance of moving food and drink through a crowded room. There was an unspoken rule about the host's own glass, too. He never let himself get ahead of his guests, never matched the heaviest drinker in the room, because the host who lost his footing lost his party. His job ran all night and required a steady hand and a clear head, so he nursed his own drink slowly and kept his attention on everyone else. The evening was a performance, and the host was always quietly, still on stage. The little dishes scattered around the room were a system, not clutter. A bowl of nuts here, a dish of mince there, a plate of crackers within reach of the far chair, placed so that no guest ever had to cross the room or ask for a nibble. The hostess thought about reach the way an architect thinks about doorways. Everything a guest might want was quietly, deliberately, already at their elbow. Flowers in the powder room, a fresh hand towel, folded just so, a small dish of guest soaps. The bathroom got the same care as the parlor. A hostess knew that every guest would visit that one small room alone, and she treated it as another chance to show she had thought of everything. It was a quiet kindness aimed at a private moment, and it is exactly the kind of detail that vanished without anyone noticing it was gone. The morning after told its own story. The hostess woke to a sink of good crystal to be hand-washed, ashtrays to empty, furniture to slide back into its everyday places, and the slow work of returning the public room to private life. She did it without complaint, because the cleanup was simply the other half of the evening. The room that had glowed the night before went quiet again, waiting for the next time it would be needed. Underneath all the rules ran a single belief that we have mostly lost. To open your home to people was an honor you offered and a trust they accepted, not a chore to be outsourced or a thing to apologize for. The 1950s hostess believed her living room could change someone's whole week, and she was often right. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that belief, more than any rule, is the thing most worth carrying forward. Step back and look at the whole machine, and you see how much went into one ordinary Friday. A single cocktail hour took a hostess hours of invisible labor spread across the day. The shopping, the cleaning, the polishing, the cooking, the dressing, all of it folded into roughly 2 hours of guests who would never see the work behind it. That was the bargain she made, and she made it again and again, often every single week. And then, slowly, the room emptied. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the formal cocktail hour began to fade. Television pulled families toward the screen instead of the circle of chairs. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers and had less time to spend a whole day staging an evening. The dinner party did not die in one dramatic moment. It simply got skipped week after week until a generation grew up never having seen one. The bar cart got wheeled into a closet. The good crystal went back up on the high shelf and stayed there. The cocktail napkins yellowed in a drawer. What replaced it all was easier and lonelier. Takeout eaten off the coffee table. Friends seen at restaurants instead of in living rooms. Hosting that meant ordering pizza rather than staging a night. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and most of this one slipped away while no one was looking. It is easy to roll our eyes at the strictness of it, the rules, the timing, the woman who never sat down. But underneath every one of these vanished customs was a single idea worth keeping. The evening was for the guests. Every rule, the cracked ice, the low flowers, the dimmed lamps, the drink offered at the door, existed to make another human being feel welcome, seen, and at ease in your home. That is not old-fashioned. That is the whole point of having a home at all. You do not need a bar cart on chrome wheels or a closet of crystal to bring any of this back. You need a clean room, a low light, something cold in a nice glass, and the simple decision to make the people in front of you the center of an evening. That was the real secret your grandmother knew. The parlor remembers, even when we forget, and the moment you turn off the overhead light and pour someone a drink with care, you remember it too. So here is what I would love from you. Tell me in the comments which of these rituals your own family kept. The signature drink, the punch bowl, the note that always arrived 2 days later. If this walk back into the parlor warmed something in you, subscribe and stay close. Because there is a whole world of these forgotten evenings still waiting in the attic.
The parlor remembers.
Come back next time, and we will bring a little more of it back into the light together.